Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on a Friday for Lessons Across the Pond, showcasing England's new net gain biodiversity policy. For those unfamiliar, this year, a biodiversity market is set to take shape in England as a mandatory net gain will come into effect this November. This is a really big deal. There are also efforts to create public money for public goods and foster environmental markets for a lot of different ecosystem services. While here in the US, we're continuing to work on stream, wetland, and endangered species habitat markets. Also, if you haven't seen, the White House just released guidance on accounting for ecosystem services and a benefit cost analysis. So there's a lot of talk about how do we quantify biodiversity and how is the most appropriate way to go about doing so. So there's a lot to learn from both of these countries' efforts, and we're hoping to create a dialogue to kind of start that exchange. So as we get ready to roll, I just want to talk about a few quick logistics. One, we are recording this presentation, so anybody that registered will receive a link early next week. Two, we hope to open up an organic dialogue and discussion today, so you should be able to use the Q&A function in Zoom to share any questions that you would like our folks to talk with. We might answer them asynchronously in the Q&A function itself or bring them to the table verbally, so just keep an eye out there. All right, Lena, I think that's good for logistics. Just a quick note on EPIC. So the Environmental Policy Innovation Center is a national nonprofit here in the United States. We believe that innovation and speed are central to broadening efforts to conserve wildlife, restoring nature, and strengthening public health. We are helping environmental programs evolve to accommodate modern understanding of human behavior and incentives, which is why we're here today to talk about one such example. Policyinnovation.org is our website if you'd like to learn more. All right, so let's get to our speakers today. So Maya Patel recently graduated with her master's in public policy from Harvard, and for her thesis wrote about the UK's biodiversity offset market and lessons that can be learned for markets here in the US. She now works in climate, energy, and environmental policy with a particular interest in environmental markets. Alicia Gibson is the director at Finance Earth, where she leads advisory projects aiming to unlock investment in nature restoration globally. She works across a wide range of ecosystem service markets with a particular specialty in UK biodiversity net gain. Tim Mayle is my colleague at EPIC. He's our founder and executive director. Prior to EPIC, he served as an associate director at the White House Council of Environmental Quality, vice president for conservation policy at Defenders of Wildlife, director at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and a co-director of agriculture policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. Lastly, I'm Grace. I'm the senior manager of the Restoration Economy Center here at EPIC, where I work on alternative procurement structures that lead to better, faster, and cheaper environmental benefits. All right. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over for a brief presentation and overview on the England policy changes, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Great. Shall I share my screen quickly?
Yeah, that'd be great.
One moment. We're gonna. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Grace. It's very nice to be here. So today, my name is Alicia Gibson, and I work at Finance Earth. Today, I wanted to introduce you to the biodiversity net gain policy in England and share some of the lessons that could be learned to inform the policies going on in the US. I have to say that much of the work that I've done was informed by some of the early policy in the US, so it's really great to be bringing this together. But as over the last few years, we've been working on biodiversity net gain opportunities in advance of policy, which is then leading to how policy is then designed in practice, building on some of what we've learned from the US. So I wanted to share some case studies and some wider work that is going on in the UK to develop ecosystem service markets more broadly, recognizing that biodiversity net gain is just one tool that can support investment in nature, but we need many more markets to really address the funding gap. Who are Finance Earth? We are a social enterprise based in London, and we have a mission to bring in investment into nature restoration and close that funding gap. We work across the investment life cycle, so we advise on investments. We then design funds that can invest across multiple projects delivering restoration, and then we manage our own funds. What we've noticed throughout this is much of what's needed to develop investable projects and funds is then the market infrastructure and policies underneath it all. So we also do a lot of market building, including designing new codes for measuring ecosystem services and supporting policy implementation that can then support new financing markets. So we're recognizing that nature restoration just can't rely on public and philanthropic funding alone. So looking where the private sector can play a role. So just a quick introduction to biodiversity net gain. So biodiversity net gain is a policy that's coming into force in November of this year, following the implementation of the Environment Act, which was set into law back in 2021. And what it aims to do is ensure that any development impact results in an overall net gain to biodiversity. So here just provides a few diagrams of the difference between if habitat's lost at development stage, that results in a net loss. Most policies are based on no net loss, where there is a mitigation requirement, but there's no requirement for net gain. Whereas the UK policy aims to ensure that any development impact then leads to a biodiversity uplift and an overall net gain. But what is important about this, and I think similarly to the US, is the mitigation hierarchy. And I think where we've been working in advance of policy is to ensure that the market really does deliver biodiversity net gain. And one of the key parts of this is obviously avoiding loss where possible. And then the market prioritizes on-site delivery to ensure that most of the loss is made up on site. And then only where loss cannot be made up on site, the developer can look to off-site biodiversity net gain options. And then in the UK, there's a last resort option where if there are no other opportunities, there's a statutory market to buy biodiversity credits from the public body that manages the environment in England. Where we play a role is ensuring that any off-site delivery of biodiversity net gain delivers as much impact as possible. And so this new policy provides an opportunity for broader nature recovery projects. And DEFRA's initial view and assessment was that it could lead to restoration of over 5,000 hectares of habitat per year, and channel much more funding from the private sector into nature restoration. So this is where we're playing a role to look at how that can be delivered in the right place at scale, and ensure that development impact does really achieve biodiversity net gain. So how the market works in the UK, on one side we have the buyers of the unit, so that's developers or in the market who are delivering development, and then on the other side we work very closely with potential sellers of those off-site units. So those can be any sort of land manager or farmer, often working with land agents and advisors to identify habitats that can be restored to mitigate for that development impact. the UK market has brought in quite a lot of legislation to ensure that this can be designed in a way that delivers the impact. So some of the key requirements are that any land needs to be maintained for a minimum of 30 years. They've brought in legal agreements through conservation covenants. They're setting up a registry that's also expected to come into place when policy does, to ensure that all units are registered and retired from the registry when they are then bought. And that's going to be operating at an England-wide level to really provide that clarity over units available and retired. And then they're also scaling up local authorities' capacity and experience to approve and monitor projects. So as I said, much of this builds on the US. The Conservation Covenant arrangement comes through some of your conservation easements and the policy itself that you have with mandatory mitigation requirements for under the Clean Water Act and equivalent policy frameworks. But there are certain differences that England have developed. So one of the major features of this market is the quantification metric for measuring biodiversity losses and gains. This looks to both calculate the impact of developments on the development site and calculates a unit, a biodiversity unit loss as a result of development. And then it also looks to calculate how that loss can be mitigated on site in a number of units as well, and then identifies the gap that then needs to be delivered off site. And then the same metric can be used to measure off-site biodiversity gain. And how the tool works is it assigns values to different features of habitat. So it looks at things like the size of the habitat, the what's called distinctiveness, which is really the certain quality and uniqueness and rarity of the habitat. Thinks about condition, whether the habitat fits in a strategically significant area, and it assigns values based on how high quality or high condition or level of strategic significance the habitat is. And then it starts to factor in time and difficulty multipliers into it. So that's to account for the fact that development impact occurs now, but the biodiversity net gain project will only deliver the net gain in the future. So there's a multiplier applied to make sure that that factor is included. And then it also considers the fact that habitats are quite difficult to create, and it's very uncertain about what might be delivered in future. So it considers the difficulty of creating as well, with a similar percentage multiplier applied. And then finally, there's a spatial risk multiplier, which accounts for the preference to ensure that biodiversity net gain off-site projects are located as close as possible to the development impact. So if a developer cannot purchase the units from a local development, there's a discount applied, and they have to purchase many more units to make up for the impact. So the aim of this is really to incentivize a mixture of factoring in a high loss quantified if a really high quality or high condition habitat is lost, so really disincentivizing loss of important habitats, and also ensuring that there's incentives to deliver it near to the development and potentially in advance of sales of the units as well, because you then factor in the shift and reduction in some of the multipliers. And so overall, these are quantified as a transferable consistent biodiversity unit. So everything is measured in these units through the metric. And then that enables a value to be placed on the unit, and then them to be bought and sold and delivered. And funding overall channeled into nature. So the next part of this, I wanted to just talk about some of the benefits and issues with the biodiversity market. So there's definitely things that I think are useful to share that could be taken forward, but also some of the issues that would be great to discuss further how we can work through to improve it in other areas. So some of the benefits of the England biodiversity market is, I think, both a benefit and a risk, is this biodiversity metric accounting tool, which does really develop that consistent approach to calculate both the loss and the gain of biodiversity, and the ability for it to apply both on-site and off-site enables then units to be traded and quantified. And I think what we've seen in England is where there are consistent codes or standards and methodologies to quantify ecosystem services, that's one of the main tools to start developing a market that can then attract funding at a larger scale. And I think another part of the metric that I've covered in brief is that it really looks at incentivizing trading up in habitat. So it doesn't allow any mitigation of habitats but in a lower distinctiveness than the development, the habitats lost from development. So it looks at increasing the type of biodiversity from development. It looks at local biodiversity net gain, and actually it's starting to provide a bit of a tool to support emerging non-compliance markets. So this is recognizing that the compliance market, which is where there's a mandatory requirement for developers to mitigate for biodiversity impact, won't be enough to actually protect and restore biodiversity. So it provides an approach to build on to start to support emerging voluntary biodiversity credit markets, which are looking at alternative tools, but also factoring in some of the benefits of this tool around the quantification of units to enable trading. Some of the other wider market infrastructure set up is also looking to be effective in terms of a registry that's set up to actually enable any gains to be recorded in a central place and track units and enable them to be allocated to any developments to avoid double counting. And then there's also a regulatory framework in place to support how biodiversity units are sold and ensure they're maintained and delivered over the long term. So, for example, England have put in place the concept of a responsible body, where organisations can apply to become those responsible bodies and take account for reviewing and monitoring the effectiveness of conservation covenants that are in place to ensure that those biodiversity gains are locked in for at least 30 years. And then finally, the government has really recognised that putting in place this kind of policy does put on more resource implications and requirements for different parties who are involved in the system, particularly local authorities. So they've provided funding to prepare local authorities for this new policy and enable them to have better resourcing to monitor and deliver as biodiversity net gain comes into force in November. However, despite some of these benefits, they do link to some issues that we've and others, and Maya through her work, have identified with this new market. So I think the metric, if you are aware of it, even this approach to measuring and quantifying biodiversity loss and gain in such a simple form is controversial in itself, because it applies values to different habitats, and that actually leads to some incentives to deliver certain habitats that are easier or cheaper to create or enhance. So there is a risk that organisations can start gaming the metric and delivering the wrong kind of habitats rather than the best, most suitable habitats based on the biodiversity unit value that that habitat might deliver, rather than the actual biodiversity and species mix and ecological connectivity as the focus. Linked to that, actually, this measurement approach is very narrow. So it relies on an ecological qualitative assessment of key features like the condition and the type of habitat, and it really projects then what could potentially be delivered over 30 years without much, not necessarily much certainty over what will happen. And it doesn't look at some of the wider factors that are really important in biodiversity, so such as species abundance. And that's where other quantification methods are coming in, thinking about how we could look to measure broader aspects to biodiversity. Despite some of the infrastructure and frameworks coming in, there are some issues in the fact that there's a lot of regulation around off-site measurement and ensuring that habitats are maintained and monitored and delivered over 30 years and deliver the uplift. But actually there isn't any guidelines or requirements for the on-site biodiversity net gain delivered by developers. So there is a risk that developers really push to deliver as much as possible on-site, which then won't be monitored and achieved in practice. And then that might risk the credibility of the biodiversity net gain system. So we see on-site measurement and guidelines as a really important part in this. One of the things that I think the US has delivered quite well in this kind of market is requirements for very long-term biodiversity mitigation into perpetuity, and ensuring structures like endowments are put in place for long-term funding of maintenance and monitoring, whereas in England, the covenant mechanisms are only required for 30-year periods. And so at the end of the 30-year project lifetime, there is no requirement for the habitat and biodiversity to be maintained. And at the moment, there's no clear funding available beyond that. So there is a risk that these habitats are then reversed after 30 years. We're hopeful that through the policy and the design and proving the outcomes and benefits that are delivered, that issue will be addressed over the lifetime, but it's not clear at this stage, which is often limiting certainty for landowners to actually move into biodiversity, and NGOs are uncomfortable at supporting projects that they're not certain will be delivered and maintained over the long term. And then finally, one of the issues is that we see in the metric compared to, again, what we see in the US is most of the way the market is designed is for units to be sold in advance of delivery of the restoration. And they don't have a mechanism like you have, which is a credit release mechanism, which is basically where you only allow credits to be sold after a certain time period when the habitat and biodiversity uplift has been achieved. And we see this presenting a risk that units are sold before restoration and then they're never actually delivered in practice, and how we can ensure there's a clawback mechanism and again that biodiversity net gain is achieved in practice. Just to move away from some of the theory and policy mechanisms, it's been great through my work at Finance Earth. We've been working with a range of project developers on the ground who are looking to inform policy and deliver habitat banks, which is effectively habitat restoration projects that deliver biodiversity units to really meet their nature recovery objectives. So one of the pieces of work I did was with multiple wildlife trusts in England, and their local organisations, often at a county level, where that work to support community-based nature restoration. And we've been developing a model that can bring in third-party investment into nature restoration projects, deliver these biodiversity units in advance of impact, and then really identify areas of strategic biodiversity and priorities to support the Wildlife Trust and their conservation work. And what we found, even in advance of policy, through the range of developers and governments interested in testing how this will work, we're already delivering transactions with developers who want to test how this works in practice. And we want to prove how this policy can be used to deliver really strategic and ecologically important nature recovery projects. So through this work, we've actually ensured that transactions have been delivered, huge amounts of hectares have been conserved and restored, and units are delivered that support local community objectives. And then separately, we've also been beyond just wildlife trusts and local charitable organisations. We've been developing this approach with local authorities, which are often the planning public sector bodies that are monitoring and developing this policy on a local level. And we've been helping them set up their own strategic biodiversity net gain projects in areas that actually support wider local community benefits. So, for example, we're identifying restoration projects in urban areas that can then be open to the public, which also may have an implication around the amount of units that can be delivered and biodiversity uplift, but supports wider connection with nature and ensures that the urban areas don't lose out through development, with off-site net gain happening far away from the development. Some wider approach we've been developing here is looking at whether biodiversity net gain policy can be designed in a different way to the national scheme. So thinking about increasing the biodiversity net gain percentage requirement. So the mandatory policy requires 10% uplift, but we've been looking at what the impact of 20% uplift would do. And we've been designing a model that supports any reinvestment of any surpluses back into green space initiatives in the city region, so that the local council and planning authorities start to recognise the broader benefits of biodiversity net gain policy in their local area, and communities do as well. Finally, what else is going on? So, as I said, biodiversity net gain, I think, is really the start of a mechanism proving how we can start to bring in the private sector and attract payments for biodiversity and habitat restoration projects in England. But that's all led to many wider initiatives. So I've mentioned voluntary biodiversity credits. It's still nascent, but there are actors that are building on this kind of metric and looking to improve it to account for wider biodiversity indications to enable voluntary biodiversity credits. The UK have taken forward some of the international carbon codes, carbon standards like the voluntary carbon standard and VERA approaches, to develop their own UK standards that account for very local specific considerations. And that's really bringing in carbon funding for really good quality projects that deliver broad range of co-benefits in their local areas, and supporting more nascent carbon frameworks for other habitats as well. The UK government have also putting in place a new scheme to actually pay farmers for environmental goods and services, instead of just paying for area of land owned and under management, and that's called the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And they're looking at how that can be stacked and blended with these other private income streams, including where biodiversity net gain can work alongside these other schemes. And then finally, we've been working to develop funding mechanisms that can actually bring in that finance that's often needed into projects in advance of delivery, and then enable a really high quality integrity market by ensuring that units and ecosystem services aren't sold until the point that they're delivered. So looking at how private investment can play a role in addressing funding gaps and delivering ecosystem outcomes that can be sold over time. So we set up a UK nature impact investment fund alongside the government and an institutional investor, and we're hoping to launch that towards the end of this year. So those are a range of different learnings and policy mechanisms and future opportunities in England. But I'll stop there, and grateful for any questions given the whistle-stop tour of various things going on. Thank you.
Awesome. That was really great. Thank you so much. So if folks have questions, they're more than welcome to pop them into the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring that. But to kick us off, I was wondering, so this is set to take shape and become mandatory within the next couple of months in November. How do you see like the private sector preparing for it? Do you feel like the private sector will be ready to kind of start delivering credits when this mandatory net gain comes into effect? What is kind of the status of a private market developing, or do you think there'll be an initial early reliance on kind of like the statutory credit schemes or the ones that the government is starting to set up?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there is a bit of a range of readiness. I think this has been taking quite a lot of time to get off the ground. So there are quite a lot of projects like we've been working on that are looking to potentially restore habitats and deliver units into the market, and keenness not to rely on the government statutory credit scheme that would then only provide units far away from developers. So that's really key to ensure that there is that supply of local units. But one of the key limiting factors at the moment has been the large uncertainty about the level of demand from the private sector. And I think many developers aren't yet ready to know what the impact of this policy will be on them. So whether they can continue as is and just design their habitat, their development projects in a way that delivers biodiversity uplift on site, or to what extent they really will need units in the market. So that is starting to stall the market because they can't go ahead and deliver and develop projects without certainty over what that will mean from the development sector. And without that monitoring in place from the local authority perspective, there is a bit of a risk that the way in which it's approached won't actually be carefully looked at. So I think it's only just been that the government have said they'll put in £9 million to support local authorities to scale up and upskill, because before that it was looking as though the policy would turn on and really the local authority and developers weren't ready to actually deliver in practice.
And are those concerns over the monitoring just concerns over the like on-site monitoring, or is it like concerns over both the on-site and offset monitoring, and like if the policy will even, like if LPAs will actually just implement the policy in general and be strict about the planning applications that come in?
I think that is another key part. So there's not necessarily the knowledge and expertise to really work out exactly what the biodiversity mitigation strategy might be on site. And then when it comes to off-site, that's one of the issues really with the metric and the way in which the market works, is that it's reliant on an ecologist going out and assessing. The baseline is probably okay, but it's a forecasted uplift that might be generated over time, and that devises the units that you can then sell before you've even started delivering. And while there are discounts in place within the metric, I think there's a really big risk that units will be sold and there isn't necessarily the right monitoring in place, or as I said, it really is incentivizing. Probably there's no regulation in terms of the type of units that the developer can buy. So it's meant to be a very sort of open market. And so there is a bit of a risk that incentivizes going for the cheapest, easiest to deliver credits that don't actually deliver the kind of biodiversity that's really needed in the local area. So we're hoping that pushing forward the wider benefits is how that's going to be addressed. So actually it shouldn't just be around biodiversity on its own, emphasizing the importance that any of these projects actually goes beyond biodiversity and the units and on their own, and actually thinks about broader outcomes like public access or flood mitigation or water quality or really important strategic rare habitats. So really emphasizing how those can be delivered and the benefits that they can achieve is actually how we're trying to push ahead and advance.
Cool. There are a couple of questions rolling in the Q&A. One related question is, what are buyers and investors typically looking for from project developers of the offset, the net gain offsite projects?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to we see two types of actors here with buyers and investors. So investors could be organizations completely outside of the development market. So there's increasing interest from these private sector investors looking to deliver biodiversity projects and potentially generate returns over time as biodiversity units are sold. So they're looking at where there might be a funding gap and maybe to acquire the land or lease the land to deliver that. And they're interested in the certainty around demand over time, aspects like the pricing that might be achieved, the number of units, and certainty over delivery and risk reduction. And then from a buyer perspective, I think the buyers here are really many of the developers in the market. And this is from our discussions before policy comes into place. I know some have been preparing, but not necessarily quite sure how it's going to work in practice. So I think they are wanting more certainty and probably ease of access. So at the moment, it's really reliant on them going out, identifying specific project developers in the local area or speaking to the local planning authority who doesn't necessarily have the expertise or knowledge to connect up. So there's definitely need a bit of facilitation around how developers can operate and support there, and then what good looks like. So I think I think some actors like the environmental engineers are really trying to push forward these wider benefits and the importance there. But it's at this stage, it's still uncertain about to what extent developers will factor those in.
Great. And then you started to talk about this a little bit, and I think the answer to this is that that's still up in the air, but someone was asking who will police the developers. My base assumption is that they will try to minimize the cost of any measures.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the policing of the developers, in some respects, it's quite reliant on initially how the planning approach works. So being able to assess the ecological plans for the on-site. So some of the work that's done so far in advance of policy, where there are already no net loss policies, has really noticed that actually there is a strong incentive to deliver on site to avoid costs, as we said. So there is a risk that this policy doesn't actually deliver much for wider habitat restoration beyond disconnected fragments of biodiversity uplift on a development site. And so I think there's going to be a real need for that regulation and monitoring and discounting actually what biodiversity can really be achieved on site. So actually thinking about, can biodiversity net gain really be delivered on a site where a development has taken place? That's something to really think about in itself as a question. So we're hoping that also that the wider from an offsite perspective, having things like conservation covenants and legal requirements in place, with also responsible bodies looking at how those are maintained and over the long term. Again, there's a funding issue there, but I think the government are starting to recognise that and actually put in resource into that.
Yeah, and I think your point about like, can biodiversity net gain really be achieved on site with development is a really key question, and kind of ties into another question that was asked, which is, are there policies in place that help encourage developers to prefer on-site biodiversity rather than rely on off-site credits?
Yeah, there definitely is. So the mitigation hierarchy is a really key part of the policy. So it's put in place to really ensure that despite we see there's a really big opportunity for this policy to support nature recovery, actually it can't be that license to trash and lose biodiversity from development sites, and particularly where local people live, and just transition that biodiversity uplift to an entirely new location. So the mitigation hierarchy is one that is quite carefully monitored and pushed forward by in the planning policy. I think we see the comparable risk that it's pushed too far towards and gives an excuse for on-site biodiversity net gain to be delivered, which actually can't be delivered in practice. So getting the balance right is really important in supporting, making sure it's maintained, while also recognizing actually that where nature recovery could be delivered in the right place elsewhere. I think there are wider strategies that are quite interesting that have been developed alongside this policy. So things like in every local area, there's been a big push to develop local nature recovery strategies to pinpoint where nature recovery should take place, and actually provide a bit more of a decision-making tool about what should go where and how, and where traditional agriculture should be maintained, where landscape recovery should be joined up, to avoid any issues about what should happen when it comes to offsite delivery. Again, that still needs further work, but it's putting it in the right place in the first place.
Yeah, and to add to that local nature recovery strategy, I believe that one of the multipliers in the biodiversity metric is if the restoration is being delivered in line with kind of some of these strategic nature recovery strategies, you get a little bit of a boost on how much credit that restoration provides. So there's incentive to try and create more strategic recovery sites. I wanted to give the opportunity for Tim or Grace if you have any questions or wanted to jump in.
Yeah, this has been just a great discussion, and it's just going to be like, I think people rightly ask a lot of questions, and you raised a lot of issues that are going to be imperfect in implementation, and to not think that because what you predict happens in the first year or the first 2 years, that means the whole thing was shit anyway, right? Like a lot of those things are predictable and fixable. And so I think I hadn't thought about this before, because as you noted in the US, we do have credit release schedules that require documentation, but the context in which we do something like BNG is for wetlands, and wetlands can be really, really hard to restore. Whereas because your BNG policy affects all biodiversity, a lot of what you're focused on is pretty common stuff that is habitat that basically restores itself if you leave a farm alone for 10 years, right? So it's like the likelihood of success for some habitat types being restored is way, way higher, and for other habitat types is way, way lower. So what I'd expect you to see without credit release schedules is, as long as the covenant and the 30-year contracts are good, and so there's just legal compliance, you'll see some really high success, or success you expected for some habitats. But then for other habitat types that are just harder on, special soils or just more finicky, you'll be like, we really shouldn't have let somebody sell all this because it hasn't, it's only produced 70% of expected gain or something, right? So you'll realize that you need a bit more caution around some things that people are just less good at, and nature itself is less good at putting back.
Yeah, I think the metric does try to account for that. So often the harder to create habitats, so something like the wetlands that you have would be counted as a high distinctiveness habitat, and then that would have a higher difficulty multiplier. And how that works, it effectively can go all the way from 10% to 90%. And if the difficulty multiplier is 10%, that immediately discounts the units that might have been generated through that calculation tool to 10% of what they would be without. So recognizing that, and you only then make back that amount once you actually achieve that target habitat, which then won't be over a long time period. So definitely does factor in those kind of things. The problem is, by doing that, it really disincentivizes the creation of those habitats, because it discounts the number of units that are generated from that. So that's why it's so difficult to design a metric that really incentivizes all the right things, so prevents development taking place on high quality to high distinctive habitats, but also encourages the restoration of those habitats to mitigate for developments that aren't on those kind of habitats. So you can see how it really is not a perfect mechanism. I think what we've seen is where there isn't any approach for measuring and quantifying these kind of outcomes, it's much harder to then attract private sector payments for those outcomes, and then you are really reliant on the public sector and philanthropy. And as I said, there have been reports in the UK and all over the world assessing what the funding gaps might be. Again, those approaches to assess that funding gap is not perfect in itself, but really looking at all the mechanisms that we can do to bring in funding, and with this net gain policy achieve beyond no net loss to transition to net gain. I think what we see is, let's try and work a way that it can work well and in the right way, instead of just assuming that it can't, that it's not worth doing in the first place because of the issues and potential complexities here.
Yeah, one other comment is that I, having gone over to England this summer to really dig into this, I really worry about the on-site projects. I mean, it is, as a different public goal, it's good to keep people and nature near each other, but that's not really a biodiversity goal. I mean, it's especially the rarer the biodiversity is, the harder it is to put it in the middle of a city, you know, at the end of the day. Isolated populations, small population size, invasive species, for all those reasons. So just trying to figure out how to get that balance right. And in the context of Clean Water Act wetland mitigation in the US, where there is very little, you know, basically assignment of points for, you know, on-site or putting the wetland restoration projects in developed areas, you know, we've seen some really big, really successful wetland restoration projects. So, you know, just, I think it feels like right now the balance in England is very much toward on-site, and finding a way to nudge that a bit, again, especially for high value habitats would be great. And just on the high value habitats thing, you know, if there was just simply a policy that allowed a topping up of credit numbers for those habitat types. So, you know, people had developed a project, basically got that difficulty discount applied, but knew they could come back in 5 years, and if it overperformed, basically get a new release of credits, right? That would be one way to basically to get investment to come in behind those projects.
Yeah, that's definitely you know, that's sort of one of the ways in which, from our side, we're trying to structure finance to deliver into projects based on those kind of mechanisms. So the fact that you could bring in that investment to deliver the habitats, and as they move through different conditions, you can then start to sell part of the units, and then another part, and then another part. So recognizing that at first you might switch your cropland to a poor quality grassland, and then at that point you could sell some units, and then once you move towards your floodplain wetland mosaic, you've really got that uplift, and you're kind of managing risk over time, and ensuring that your units are delivered and your biodiversity uplift is achieved. So I think that's a feature, but one of the issues around that is it does add to complexity, and before the market's put in place, trying to design policy in a way that ensures sort of that one of the reasons policy being designed that enables units to be sold up front is when thinking about how you structure legal agreements and sales contracts and managing the land and the habitat management plan. Once you start to shift unit sales and delivery timeframes and covenant timeframes, it adds to a lot of complexity. And so we're still trying to encourage that policy is designed in a way that really ensures that that these kind of mechanisms can be put in place. And it's still a bit of a sticking point.
And one comment, and Maya, one question, and then I'll pivot back to you. The comment is that, like, in the U.S., bank the enabling agreement for a mitigation site might be 100 pages long, right? So I definitely get the complexity issue. My question is, you mentioned on one of your early slides the third-party registry, basically credits for offsite projects, and third-party, for us at least, I mean that means non-governmental. Is there going to be like a standardized registry that tracks all parties, bank or restoration sites, or is it going to be there's going to be multiple registries? How is that going to play out?
Yeah, so there's going to be it's still in testing and piloting mode, but it's been sort of indicatively launched, a single national registry. for units. Again, one of our issues is it only includes off-site units, so it's not going to include on-site units linked to the monitoring requirements. And that actually is going to track all units under agreements with developers nationally. There's also a lot of local led schemes to try and establish registries in specific areas, but those aren't really sort of backed by the government. They're more around supporting local transactions and connections and identifying the most important projects, because partly one of the problems with the market is it's not going to be sufficient to fund all the restoration projects in the local area. So having some sort of governance mechanisms to prioritize and make decisions and work out where development should mitigate where there is a need for off-site delivery is one of the things that local registries are kind of trying to deliver. I think one of the side of things is the government have said they don't want to develop any kind of market-based registry that allows buying and trading of credits on a central platform. So they're looking at what the private sector do around that. And at this stage, there isn't an obvious central marketplace for units. And not much certainty when it comes to things like, I think there was a question on how pricing is determined. And at the moment, it's really just based on bespoke agreements and data gathering to then start to indicate what the price is looking like, and still questions around whether it's going to vary per habitat or per location, but trying to make sure that it really does cover the costs over the 30-year time period and beyond, and ensuring that sales up front don't end up meaning that they've been sold at too low a price and that it never actually provides that funding to maintain over the lifetime given the uncertainty. So those are some of the things that the market is trying to factor in at the moment.
Well, my big question is what do we think this means for the US right now? Like, we've been talking with landowner associations and like carbon portfolio managers, and there seems to be an interest in biodiversity, at least on like the voluntary scale right now. So I'm curious to hear what you all think that could mean in the US current landscape.
I'm sure Tim has some views as well, but I think one of the things that is interesting in England is the way that this policy applies to all development impact. Well, it will do soon. So it's currently just housing development. Soon it'll apply to small scale ones, even up to just a few houses, and then national major strategic infrastructure projects. And I think the way it's not just on wetlands and streams and thinking about much broader development impact is something that it seems to be an easier way of quantifying impact and uplift, so is a good place to start. One of the things we're seeing that's quite difficult to start to move towards a voluntary biodiversity credits system is around how claims can be made and where impact happens away from that area. The opportunity to actually mitigate far away from the supply chain is still a bit questionable about market integrity there, but actually starting from a voluntary but development-led approach, I think, is something that has quite a lot of potential over the near term, then starting to shift towards that voluntary outside of development and linked to supply chain impact. So that's one thing, but I'd be interested in all of your thoughts as well, having heard from this.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Maya, feel free to as well. Right now, there's just so little US government or state government awareness of this that's one of our goals, right, Grace, to like keep talking about the UK policy and England's specific approach to it. But I think from a business perspective, to satisfy investment demands, so many businesses are looking at ways to assess their kind of footprint and come up with ways to benefit biodiversity that match that footprint. And the crediting system you all have developed has got some pretty universal applicability in the United States for the same purposes, and a simplicity of implementation that our policies lack. So I see that as being the biggest potential immediate use, and eventually the global investment policies are going to move so fast in this direction that people in the US are going to realize, wait a second, all of our multinational companies or any domestic company that's already that's getting international investment is already complying with this. Like we need to know what's going on here. So I think that's the biggest implementation opportunity. And I really think that the DEFRA 4.0 metric is the no net loss or net gain, right? That's the most important thing, is the public understands that the outcome of this is supposed to be that nature is better off, right? So that's positive framing. That's really important, and we've struggled with that in the United States. And the other is just having a metric that people can hire a botanist to go out and run, and they can have a botanist they trust come back to them and say, yeah, this is how it works, this is the site, this is what we do, here's a plan, right? Like you can hire an expert to do it, and you can go back to doing what you're doing, and the expert can come back to you and tell you this is the answer. Like that's the thing that's really bedeviled a lot of areas of US policy, where you have to always ask an individual human, what do you think? And they just make up an answer that, as far as you can tell, right? Like they just make up an answer. You can't actually sort of see the math, and you guys have come up with a system that allows people to see the math. So I think it has just a lot of sort of reliability, validation built into it that we really hope to see take off.
It is actually being used as well, I think, for example, in a similar way, some of the carbon verification frameworks that I was referring to at the end of the presentation have recognized as well that the importance of measuring biodiversity alongside the carbon impact and the wider benefits that can have. And there's a scheme that's in development that's actually applying the biodiversity metric alongside then a carbon framework to prove that projects deliver biodiversity uplift alongside carbon. So again, that's a voluntary market that's then using biodiversity quantification methods to actually apply into that market and building on it in a voluntary way. So that also could be another way that the metric could be used, even if you don't have the compliance mechanisms in place to actually incentivize payments from development.
That makes sense. One last question before we are at time here. I wanted to zoom out for a second and look to like the world. You mentioned in your presentation, there was some learnings from US markets that helped inform this, but what are some of the other markets around the world that have been either helpful in informing this biodiversity market, or just that you've looked to as like interesting examples of environmental markets?
Yeah, so good question again. I think much of what we looked into, we did initially look a lot into the US. So I definitely the conservation easements, the credit release mechanisms, the policy mechanisms in place, the in perpetuity management. So lots of those things and the way it was leveraging private investment in advance of delivery at a broader scale. So when it comes to markets beyond the US, much of what we've seen is looking at biodiversity mechanisms and their failures, and the way biodiversity offset policies haven't delivered the impact all over the world they should have done, and many studies taking place to see that there have been a lot of challenges. So that's where biodiversity net gain and trying to look at how it can be designed in a way that sort of actually delivers the impact before it's been put into place is something that we're really keen to see. The other thing where I've seen positive aspects is moving beyond just terrestrial markets for biodiversity. So some countries have transitioned this policy into coastal and even marine impacts. And so we're trying to take those kind of learnings in England. That I should have put that on what's to come next. There's a marine net gain policy that's being talked about, and consultations gone out to actually put this in place outside of just terrestrial landscapes, and that builds on some of where there's sort of island economies that really rely on developments, but also need to mitigate their impact. So those are some of the mechanisms, but generally addressing failures and learning from high success mechanisms, which I think actually the US is where we spotted the most there. Some of the challenges around like for like impact, I think we've seen where mechanisms are put in place to ensure that any loss is mitigated by exactly the same habitat, although the English mechanism is criticised by not requiring like for like, that actually often ensures no delivery because you can't always achieve like for like impact. So generally lessons to learn to address issues rather than opportunities, I see.
Awesome. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I know there's many more questions and I could continue asking you a lot more. But thank you so much for your presentation and all of the great discussion. And I'll kick it off to Grace.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us today. We just hit the tip of the iceberg, I think, but that's great to have some momentum around this topic. You all will be receiving a link to the recording of this webinar next week. And I will put my email address in the chat in case any further questions come up. So thank you all, and we will see you soon.
Thank you for having me and for everyone joining.
Thank you.